Okay, we're gonna get started. When Charlie first rented the space upstairs, I didn't know him, and someone had said to me, "Oh, he's went to school here. He had a studio here before." So Michael, one of the other instructors, came to me and told me about his obsession with the Gardner Museum heist. And I was like, I've been obsessed with the Gardner Museum heist for like 20 years. So I went up to his studio. Little did I know, literally he talked about it for like 5 hours. I was like, I gotta go. But I was like, that was the catalyst for this whole lecture series, was that day, that initial conversation. And I said to him, I was like, let's do it. So that's why we started doing these lectures. And when you hear about the things he's done with these people who are thought to have been involved, and the people he's met in his travels trying to figure out what was going on or where what happened during the heist, it's quite incredible. So Charlie, take it away.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me back there? Is this thing working? Okay. This is a discussion on the art robbery that occurred 34 years ago at the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, in which $500 million worth of art masterpieces were stolen. But before I get started, let me get a little philosophical with you. This is a Chinese character, Wu, done by my Kung Fu teacher, and it means nothing. He always said, you have to get something. This means nothing. And there is in Chinese philosophy, they talk about a metaphor for the brain being overfull with too much knowledge. You put too much wine into a cup and it overfills. Once there's so much wine in a cup, you can't put no more in. It's full to the brim. So you have to empty your cup, you have to empty your mind to put more wine in, to put more knowledge in. So this is a good metaphor for this investigation, because over the 34-year-long investigation, most of the people that have been investigating, researching, reporting on this case are now cups full of wine to the brim. This is the Qing Dynasty gu that was stolen that night. One of the items stolen that night in 1990. It was used in ritualistic ceremonies. They drank wine in ritualistic ceremonies. This really resonates with me, this item. It's the oddball piece of the other works that were stolen. Today, we're not going to pour out the wine. I think spilling wine is sacrilegious. We're just going to drink down it all and empty the cup, I hope. I'm going to try to tell the story in a different way than it's usually told over 34 years. Most of the suspects, stories, theories, myths that were created must be put aside now. It's a 34-year-old investigation, an old cold case. They'll try to tell you it's not a cold case, but 34 years, nothing has been discovered. It's a cold case. And there sure are a ton of myths and stories and tall tales and a circus-sized number of characters that have been questioned as suspects. So tonight, let's drink down the cup and empty it. This is a fingerprinting on a fingerprint card I did of the gu. As a cultural property protection resource person, I've put a lot of time and energy into this case, but also as an artist, a lot of my artistic voice expresses this case, and this inspires a lot of my work, so I'm going to be showing some of them tonight. So over the next hour, we're going to discuss the 1990s and the details of the crime, the incidents that occurred years prior to the crime leading up to that fateful day, and a vial of paint chips that were sent to the Boston Herald that were an exact match to the stolen Vermeer, the concert, which was displayed in that frame right there. That's the empty frame that once held the concert of Vermeer. Those chips were the only sign of life that the painting still exists that they ever received. That was in 1997. I'll get into that in a little bit. We're going to discuss the $10 million reward, the immunity offers that are on the table, and the possible involvement of real police officers in this crime. The robbers, dressed as Boston Police Department officers, knocked on the side door of Palace Road, the side door of the museum called Palace Road. These are two little drawings I did after the sketches of the Boston Police Department This is the real sketches that they did of these. So two criminals knock on the side of Palace Door Road and they let them in, and they did these sketches after the heist with the composite sketch artist. This is a Whitey Bulger FBI card. I doctored it up with a little pastel and oil, but Whitey Bulger was a mob boss in South Boston, Irish mob, always was suspect. So there's been thousands of leads and suspects and stories since 1990, and everyone loves to talk about them. They floated many, many theories like the Irish mob and Whitey Bulger, the mob boss, who in the end knew nothing. Everyone thought he's the big guy in South Boston, he has to know everything, the Irish mob did it, he has to know. They also discussed the Irish Republican Army, the Japanese Yakuza, Corsican criminals, and now the Italian mob, at least ever since 2013, when an FBI special agent in charge of the office named Richard Deslayer did a press conference claiming they knew who pulled off the heist, they solved the job, all the men are dead, but they refused to give their names. So they heavily insinuated an Italian mob connection. So they went from Corsicans, the Yakuza, the Irish mob, the IRA, into the Italian mob, and everyone loves a good mob story. You know, in America, mob movies are like the cowboy movies now. So over the years, the feds have chased down many leads, and many, many leads over 34 years, and some are ridiculous. Like one time they went to Japan, someone gave them a tip that a guy had a painting, one of the paintings in his house. They went with the Japanese authorities into his house. It turned out to be a replica, a good copy that he liked to impress the ladies with. There's so many stories like this, and they love to tell them, especially the reporters. The agents should tell them like a back in the day story, like back in the day to their grandkids, you know, back in the day this happened. And the reporters have to tell this over and over because they have to report on it. The Boston Globe and the Boston Herald and even the New York Times are expected to report on this story. And over 34 years, they have parroted the same lines and stories, pounce on anything new like this mob theory, and it's parroting. And in the end, they all want to write books and sell books and make podcasts, and they all want to film, right? So tonight, with only a couple colorful exceptions, I will cut through the fluff and only talk about stories that I think allows us to connect some dots and that I think are interesting. It is time to tell this 34-year-old story in a different manner instead of the same selective drip that comes from the authorities and the usual media parroting. Keep in mind that I'm greatly condensing, because it's a 34-year-long cold case and I can go on forever. So many interesting stories and characters, and I mean circus size, right? It's a tent full of characters, man, and we're not gonna go on for hours about it, but I'll cut through the fluff. Let's start with the actual theft and the proceeds from the Gardner that was stolen in 1990 to give you an idea of the enormity of the theft, and I'll go back in the timeline of events after that theft to 1973. On March 18th, 1990 at 01:24 a.m. in the morning, which was a good choice for the robbers to pick that day and time because it was St. Patrick's Day, 17 into 18, the busiest night in Boston. All the police are busy. I'm standing, the two criminals dressed as police knocked on that door on Palace Road. I'm standing in front of it there with the director of security, now director of security, Anthony Amore. And the guard inside of the desk was, to follow protocol, he wasn't supposed to buzz him in until he called Boston PD to confirm, did you dispatch officers here? He failed to do so or chose not to do so. He buzzed them in. The security was poor in that museum. There was 2 guards on at night. One did his rounds, one sat at that desk. They had surveillance cameras that registered on a VHS tape, and there were motion detectors, and there was one panic alarm under that guard's desk that went to the police station. So when the criminals entered, he buzzed them in, and when the criminals entered, the guard's name was Rick Abad. He recently died last month, which is interesting. So they asked him where his partner was. He said he's doing his round. His name was Randy, the other guy in the rounds. He said, call him down. They want to bring him down, get them both together. Then they told him, you look familiar. Now he's still behind the desk where he can hit the button and get the police there. They said, you look familiar. I think you got a warrant. Come out from behind the desk. He comes out from behind the desk. They throw him against the wall. They cuff him up. The other guy comes down. They cuff him up. They tell him this is a robbery. You know, we aren't police they told them they were there to investigate a disturbance in the courtyard, but instead they're robbing them. So now they are away from their panic button, and no one's gonna come to help them at this point. They brought them way down to the basement, apparently knowing the way. They had inside scoop on this, because it wasn't easy getting down to the basement. And they taped them up and cuffed them up like this, as you see here. This is Rick Abath. He was a musician. That night he had on his fanny pack, he had on the tie-dye shirt, he had a big pink cowboy hat, which they put alongside of him. He didn't go into security. Security was really poor there. The thieves, after they take these guys up away from each other, they spent 81 minutes in that museum, which is a really long time to pull off a job like this. Usually they're in and out. Guys, I mentioned in the last lecture, the guy stole the Vincent van Gogh. It took him less than 5 minutes to get in and steal the Van Gogh from that museum in Amsterdam. 81 minutes. They were confident and calm and appeared to have known the police were not coming. They did have contacts out on the street. They had radios and they had radio contact with their lookouts on the street. This is a layout of the museum. They entered in this door on the first floor, 0124 Palace Road. They went right up to the Dutch room, the first room they entered, which is upstairs. And from the Dutch room, they stole the following masterpieces. This is Johannes Vermeer, The Concert. Arguably, without a doubt, the most valuable painting stolen that night. This is Rembrandt Van Ryn's Storm on the Sea of Galilee. And this is Rembrandt, Lady and the Gentleman in Black. These two paintings are very large, and they were both brutally cut from their stretcher bars and the frames thrown on the ground. They were damaged. Van Ryn portrait is a young man. This is a very small etching. Govart Flink, which was on the other side of the Vermeer, another Dutch. Here's the Shang Dynasty Gu I showed you earlier. I really like this. I see here there's a mythological creatures in these Gus, and it's like eyes. And in the old Kylix cups and the Greeks used, they had the eyes of Bacchus. So it's really interesting that there's these correlations between East and West. I kind of dig that. Before I move on, let me get into the beauty of these paintings. Just to give you an idea what we're looking at here. This is the concert, and there's only 35 or 36 Vermeers in the world, depending on who you listen to. The National Gallery of Art has one. They debunked it. They say now it's not, but the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam doesn't agree with them, so they're not in agreement. So 35 or 36 is a very small number of works compared to like a Rembrandt. This painting has a woman playing a harpsichord, a man with a lute, and another woman that appears to be singing. It might have, they used to believe it had an erotic undertone and might have been a brothel, a high-end brothel. This is the old belief. And there is a painting in the painting, you see here, Dirk van Babberen's The Procuress, if I can find it. And it shows a woman with a lute, the client, and a woman telling them, you gotta pay, right? And it kind of mimics, because here's woman playing, man, and another woman like this. And there's this instrument. So there are instruments in Dutch art back then, and music did have erotic undertones. This shows up in 4 paintings by Vermeer, including the music lesson, always on the floor. So we don't know exactly what he meant, but here's a tranquil scene on the harpsichord. Nowadays, a lot of experts don't believe. They believe that Van Babberen this is a tranquil scene, and that was a warning against excesses of lust and eroticism. And they point to the fact that, by the way, this painting wasn't his family. His mother-in-law, Maria Tins, owned that. And it ends up in, this is in 2 of Vermeer's paintings, that Van Babberen, he liked it. But, so that family was really devoutly Catholic, and so they're really not sure exactly what this means. On this Sea of the Storm of Galilee, everyone loves the parrot. This is one of his greatest paintings. I love it. Everyone loves it. It's amazing. It's a shame it got cut from the frame. They literally butchered it. So these guys were really hardened criminals and good criminals, right? Good at pulling off jobs. They weren't good at handling art. They weren't professional art thieves. But in this, they like to parrot the fact that this is his only surviving seascape. It's his only seascape. It's his only, one person says it and they say it over and over. There might be a boat in some ways, but this is a religious painting, right? And it's very interesting. It's from Matthew 8:23 through 27, in which they get into the sea, the boat, and they're going to go out onto what's the Lake of Nazareth, but it's called the Sea of Galilee. It's an interesting thing because though in reality, the way the land gets hot and cold and the water, and they do have these tremendous storms. And they went out on a boat, and Jesus falls asleep, and the storm comes, and they're gonna drown, and they start getting all scared. And this is the perfect metaphor for this failed investigation. This is the perfect metaphor for the Gardner investigation. Here in the light, Rembrandt went into this. It really is a great painting. Here in the light, you see the men who were fishermen, the disciples like Peter. They were fishermen. They know the sea. They have their own ability as humans, right? And they're going to save that ship with their own human ability. But in reality, they're all going to drown. Over here, you got in the dark. Rembrandt put in the dark the most cowardly. They're afraid they're going to die. This one over here is thrown up over the ship. Only Jesus is calm. The waves obey him. And he scolds him. He says, "You men of little faith. You know, where's your faith?" And here's Rembrandt. He painted himself right in, and he's looking right out at the viewer. So it's a really amazing painting. I really like how he put, and I think it's a great metaphor for this investigation. Now, this Rembrandt was done when he was 23 years old, and it was directly across from the Sea of Galilee. They took that off the wall, but they didn't feel like going through all the trouble and work, because like the Vermeer, they smashed the glass. They had to take the Shang Dynasty glue was attached to the desk. It took them like 10 minutes to get them off. I'm sure their wrists got tired, which kind of shows their age, because a young man might have kept going. I believe this is on a wood panel, but it would have been work to get it out of the frame. And they had cut, and I'm sure his hands after cutting those two huge paintings was tired. You got to think of these when you're looking at the investigation. This one they left behind. They left it facing against the wall, and fortunately for all of us, Boston, America, the museum, they didn't steal this. The one thing I like about Isabella is how she curated, and this one, she was an artist in her own right. The way she curated her own museum. And this one is looking right at the storm of the Sea of Galilee. They look at each other. That is the loot from the Dutch room. Just this Dutch room haul alone would have been considered the masterful heist of the century. But they had a lot of people, these crooks had a lot of people second guessing their expertise and common sense and ability, because one of them left the Dutch room and went to the short gallery and stole 5 Degas drawings of lesser value. There were many artworks they could have stolen, and instead they steal these. So stolen from the short gallery, Edgar Degas, and this is jockeys leaving the paddock on horses, 3 jockeys. Here you have procession on the road to Florence, and you got 2 studies for programs. They also stole this Antoine Denis Chaudet, Eagle Finial, which is another oddball, but they wanted that flag. That was the flag of the 1st Regiment of Grenadiers of Foot of Napoleon and his Imperial Guard, and it was housed in glass. And unlike the other guy who broke the glass and took out the Vermeer, he tried to take out all the screws of this case, and he got tired, and he threw the screws in an ashtray with sand, but he settled with the eagle. So he stole that eagle. Maybe he thought it was funny to steal the eagle, or maybe he thought it was gold and that he could melt it down. Also, the only thing stolen from the 1st floor, from the blue gallery downstairs, was Edward Manet's Che Tortoni. We'll go into this more later because it's intriguing. This is my version of Che Tortoni, fingerprint ink on a fingerprint card. It was featured in Ulrich Bolzer's book, The Gardner Heist. Bolzer is a really nice guy, but he had some embarrassing moments in that book. I'm not going to get into it. and he got a lot of things wrong, but a lot of people he interviewed were upset with him after this. All the paintings that were stolen were removed from their frames, and the frames were left behind. I'm told they may have been erroneously cautioned that some of the frames had some type of alarm. They were wired into alarms, which explains why they went through all the great lengths to remove the frames, even the small etching, which they could have just threw in their pocket frame and all. They actually had brought a little tool with them that took out the special screws that held it together. So they believed that the frames were wired in. Real quick, last year I was in an episode of World's Greatest Heist with Pierce Brosnan. I'd like to take this opportunity to correct a huge error that the editors did that made me look uninformed. I stated that the robbers brutally cut the Rembrandts from the frame, from the stretcher bars, and that was true. But they spliced two different comments together. They had me say, and they did the same to the pride of the museum, the Vermeer. They absolutely did not cut the Vermeer, and I knew that, but the way the editors spliced it together makes me look like I said something erroneous, and that bothers me. Also, I got into the paint chips and the Billy Youngworth story, and all of the experts that tested the paint chips, they chose not to put that in, unfortunately, but I was told that they only had so much time. With commercials, that was an hour long, but it really was like 42 minutes long. And they didn't think, again, they wanted mob, you know, the mob had the auto shop, but paint chips, maybe the audience would have not been so interested. But I'm gonna get into it with you because it is interesting. But other than that, I love Pierce Brosnan. I'm a big fan, and I'm honored that I was in it. I thought the show was great. I'm not gonna get into the fine details of this crime or their movements because my time is limited and too many people have repeated this many times over 34 years. The main points should be discussed. One main point I want you to take note of was this was a masterful job done by hardened professional criminals, the types that rob armored cars and banks. They did not show weapons of any kind, and they did not use force or violence, albeit they used what police call constructive force and mechanical force. Giving verbal commands and making arrests with your authority is constructive force. Handcuffs is mechanical force. They were sophisticated and cautious about force or violence, which does not enhance charges if caught. Also, they handcuffed the guards in a professional manner so they wouldn't get too tight, and they checked on them during the robbery to see if they were okay and still breathing. Cops always put the handcuffs on a certain way. They put their pinky in to make sure they're not too tight, and they double cuff so that when you struggle, they don't get too tight. And it's tight enough you can't slip out of, not loose enough that they don't hurt your wrist. So cops are professional at cuffing, and criminals would not be. And these criminals cared about the welfare of the guards, maybe because they didn't want a murder charge. If you do a robbery and one of the victims of the robbery dies, you get a murder charge. It's no longer a robbery. Or maybe one or two real police officers who were involved in this job, or at least it gave them guidance. It isn't discussed in the press, but it has always been silently looked at. That would explain their confidence that the police were not coming that night. The robbers had radio contact with their lookouts on the street, but maybe the lookouts had a real radio and knew the police weren't coming. If real police department officers were in on this job of hardened criminals, they would have been unstoppable. And that's just something to think about, and I'm going to fill you in on some of the antics of the police department and the FBI in that office at that time in this very volatile city. So here is an article from the Globe, Boston Globe, on horse fixing. The Irish mob were fixing races not only in Boston but all over the country, really. But main points to remember from that job, that first part of this heist. There was no violence. They didn't show or mention weapons. They cared about the welfare of the guards. They had no fear of time or police arrival. And more importantly, this was the perfect job. They didn't get caught. No one ever got charged. The paintings were never recovered. The FBI agent in charge of this investigation in Boston, Jeff Kelly, said on TV not a couple years ago, it was a botched job. They didn't make any money. It wasn't the perfect job. That's not a true statement. You can't make that statement. You don't know that they didn't sell one of these or they didn't make money. So this was the perfect job. They were criticized for taking works of lesser quality from the short room. If they only took the Vermeer or the Storm of Galilee alone by Rembrandt, they would have been lauded as master thieves. They took the drawings because they thought they could easily sell them. You know, you can't sell a Rembrandt. You might be able to sell his drawings. Maybe they didn't think there was going to be international coverage of this the next day, and everything got so hot they couldn't sell anything. And also there was this interest in horse race fixing. A hitman for the Winter Hill gang, which is Whitey Bulger's gang, was running this. And here, 21 indicted in the race fixing probe. So, I mean, there was a lot of interest in horses as well, and that might have prompted them also. They like horses. Without a doubt, they went into the Dutch room with a shopping list. They went there with a list of what they were going to take. Definitely from the Dutch room, but maybe from the short gallery as well. Remember, they questioned their cunning. Why did they take these? They could have took a Botticelli. They could have took, a Raphael. They walked right through the other rooms with intention to get to the short gallery. The director from 1970 to 1988 was Roland Bump Hadley. He wasn't very concerned about security. He was forced out by the board, and a woman named Ann Hawley took over. She came in, and they started discussing revamping security. Remember, I told you it was so poor. Now they wanted to revamp it. Some people involved in the planning stage of this robbery may have been detained at the time of the robbery, and may have heard that they were going to revamp security and sent in serious criminals with a shopping list in their plan. They wanted to do the job before security was beefed up. It was a now or never decision. The robbery occurred 6 months into Hawley's new role as a director, and she was going to revamp security. A nice way to start a job, right? Here's another picture of Bump. So when they were finished, when these robbers were finished, they went back downstairs to see if the guards could breathe and see if they were all right. They went back up and took the VH tape, eliminating any chances of the investigators seeing what they did and how they worked. They took the readout to the motion detectors that they had, but they didn't know that downloaded onto a hard drive. So they know all of their movements throughout the building. That's why we know they went to the Dutch room, and one went right through all those rooms, right in a couple minutes, right into the short gallery with intention. Here is an FBI wanted poster of some of the works. That's the Che Tortoni up in the cover. So as I previously mentioned, someone took the Che Tortoni of Monet from the Blue Room on the first floor. Only problem is, the criminals, as far as the motion detectors are telling us, never entered that room. Only the security guard who buzzed them in, Rick Bath, entered that room at about midnight. They entered 124. He entered that room at midnight when he was doing his rounds and relieved Randy after that. So the frame to that was found on the director's chair near the VHS recorder. The FBI questioned the guard and never charged him with anything. And they gave him a lie detector test, which was inconclusive. And again, he just died recently. So if the guard, Rick Bath, was in on it, he took the painting at midnight, and the robbers took it out for him. And if he wasn't in on it, then that means that there was a second theft. Or the motion detectors were not foolproof. But a security expert named Lane was brought in after the robbery and confirmed that they were working properly. Some of the guards claimed that they would creep around the building and try to avoid setting off the motion detectors and the alarms. So even the Bath claimed he did it, so it was like a game of theirs when they were bored making their round. But this Manet is a big headache of the initial investigation. One more thing about Bump Hadley. Here he is with the the director of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. His name doesn't come up much anymore. He lived in an apartment in the museum. The directors, until Bump Hadley, lived in the apartment. He was already gone when they pulled off this robbery. Ann Hawley came in, she didn't live there. But he lived in that building. And he used to throw these parties, some were pretty wild parties, in his apartment. And after the robbery, they went and talked to all the contractors that worked in the building, all the people that worked in there, got brought in from outside. But he refused to give his guest list and refused to cooperate. One of the more powerful board members, Arnold Hyatt, very wealthy man, very good board member on the board, pushed for Bump's ouster and Aunt Hawley's hire. And again, Bump was not interested in revamping security, and Hawley planned on doing so. And Hadley and his supporters were pretty upset about his treatment. So that was March 18, 1990. Let's go back to 1974. Back in time to a burglary in 1974 that occurred over the Memorial Day weekend at the Woolworth Estate in Maine. In this burglary, 5 paintings by Andrew Wyeth and Nancy Wyeth were stolen, as well as a grandfather clock and other beautiful items. The heist was pulled off by a notorious New England art thief named Miles Connor, seen here in the oil painting I did of him. Connor alleged that his friend Bobby Donati planned the Woolworth burglary and brought Miles along with him because Miles had the connections to fence the items. Antiques, paintings, clocks. We only have Miles' word on it, on Donati's involvement, and this cannot be confirmed. Connor also alleges that Donati pulled off the Gardner heist, the Gardner robbery in 1990 with another friend named David Houghton while Connor was incarcerated in a federal prison. This has absolutely never been confirmed, but it's Connor's story, and a lot believe him. Houghton died in '92 of a heart attack, and Donati, seen here as a young man in a mugshot, is also dead. In September 1990, 5 months after the Gardner Museum robbery was pulled off, Donati was found in the trunk of his Cadillac, stabbed 20 times with his throat cut. Again, Connor claims Donati was his partner in the Woolworth Estate burglary, and that can't be confirmed. The only arrest that was made was Connor. He was arrested in July 1974 on Cape Cod by the FBI with many of the stolen artworks. In April 1975, Miles Connor, while out on bail for the Woolworth heist, steals this Rembrandt off the wall of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. 2 men, one carrying a pistol, walked into the Museum of Fine Arts, grabbed that painting off the wall and started running out. They fired 3 shots as they left. A security guard who was a retired Boston PD officer, an old guy from Boston PD, wasn't going to let them get away. He grabs onto him. They hit him in the head with the gun. Luckily, they didn't shoot him. This painting was done in 1632. Elizabeth Van Ryn, it was Rembrandt's sister. It was sold in 1986 for $10.3 million. Note that a gun was used. Violence was used in this crime, unlike the Gardner. Connor used this Rembrandt as a bargaining chip to reduce his prison sentence for the theft of the Wyeth paintings. And he turned 2 4-year bits into 1 4-year sentence by returning the painting. The painting was recovered by state and federal officials in January 1976. It's pretty ingenious. So Miles stole a Rembrandt to lighten a prison sentence, and the word went out in the underworld that hot art is a get-out-of-jail-free card. So Connor claims he and Donati cased the Gardner several times during the 1980s. A lot of people cased the Gardner. They were all casing the Gardner. And mind you, Boston, if you go to Boston, it's this nice, quiet Boston. No, Boston was wild. It was the Wild West, right? So he claims he told Donati he liked the Chinese goo. And he claims Donati told him, hey, I like that eagle. That's what he claims. And he wrote a book too, and he's probably getting a movie deal now too. So they all want to write books. They all want to be guilty. I did the Gardner, right? But they really thought he was in on it because of who he was. This is a photo of Miles holding one of his samurai swords from his collection. I took that photo of him in his Blackstone, Massachusetts house back in 2010. In mid-September 1981, bear with me because something happens every year. There's another shot of Miles getting arrested. So in mid-September 1981, an FBI agent named Clark contacted the security foreman of the Gardner. His name was Charles Hydorn, and he informed him that some heavy-hitting criminals were casing the Gardner and planning on robbing it. Their names were Mark Rossetti, seen here, and Louis Royce, who joined Rossetti's gang. He was a very proficient burglar. Mark Rossetti was an individual tied to the patriarchal crime family, New England mob, and he had a very large crew. There's the whole organization. They planned on, it was actually Royce's idea, and he turned them on to the Gardner. They planned on throwing smoke bombs into the courtyard during a classical music concert to cause a commotion and they were going to steal a Matisse and a Sergeant when everyone starts running around chaotically. So they were arrested before they did this, and Agent Clark told Hydorn that they either had a man on the inside, a guard, or they had a tapped resource. Hydorn brought this to Director Hadley, Roland Bump Hadley's attention, and he took it very lightly. But now they know that organized crime heavy hitters are casing the place, and eventually, and at least they start talking about revamping security, but the talk and the discussion of it might have propelled the criminals to actually pull off the heist. Also in 1981, an art thief named Brian McDevitt conspired with another man to rob the Hyde collection in Glens Falls, New York. Many of the original investigators in the Gardner Museum, including the first investigator on the case, Dan Falzone, believed he was a suspect. They suspected him and Connors and a few other art thieves right away. But they saw in his plan to pull off the Hyde heist a couple similarities. So in 1981, him and his partner kidnapped a FedEx driver. They used ether to put her out. They taped her up and they donned FedEx suits and carried handcuffs to cuff the museum guards. They were going to enter as FedEx guys on a job delivering and then overpower the guards and handcuff them. This is the slight similarities to the Gardner job, because the Gardner crooks used BPD uniforms and had handcuffs but I will continue to point out that the Gardner crooks were not so violent or crude, and I'll keep pointing out that many of these suspects were just crude criminals with no finesse, like those Gardner guys that pulled off the job. So while en route to the Hyde, they run into traffic and bad traffic, and arrived at the Hyde after it closed. So they bungled the job. They never got to enter. After the truck driver called the police, he was free, tells the police what happened. They figured out who it was. They arrested him. This was a complete bungled job done by a character who wanted to write a screenplay in the end. I mention this story because it shows that one, stealing art and Rembrandts, they wanted to steal a Rembrandt, was getting in vogue. And he is a real cartoon character, one whose name comes up and some people still insist he did the robbery. The similarities they point to again are the uniforms and the handcuffs, but they planned on stealing a Rembrandt along with many other paintings. But the Gardner robbery was a perfect job, and these fools totally bungled this robbery. And the Gardner thieves had finesse and never used force. McDevitt denied all involvement. He was questioned by the feds and denied all involvement. He was interviewed by 60 Minutes in 1992 and kind of alluded to the fact that he did it. But he was writing a screenplay about an art theft, and he wanted to sell this thing. And many believe he was only trying to maximize his profile to promote the screenplay and gain notoriety from the Gardner robbery. To add to the intrigue, though, he fled to Colombia, where he died in 2004. And his girlfriend alleges recently that he admitted to her he was paid to do the Gardner job and he had to leave the country. I do not believe he was smart enough, when you look at the circumstances, was smart enough to pull off this job. So in 1982, there was a burglary of photo equipment, and this is important because it was overlooked, and some cheap paintings from the Simmons College, which is on Palace Road, right across the street from the Gardner. And the Gardner guard on duty allegedly allowed the burglars to see in the Gardner that same evening. But remember, everyone was casing the Gardner. That's the Simmons, and that right there is Palace Road, and that is the Venetian Palace, the Gardner. So it's right next to it. Supposedly they were erroneously cautioned that night that some of the frames in the Gardner were possibly wired into the alarms. A crew that was making good fake IDs and selling them on the black market, they needed equipment after they lost their photo equipment in a drug raid. One of the guys got them raided. This is Joel McDonald, the hitman that was running that, a very tough guy. Was running that horse race fixing scandal in Boston. This crew was making licenses for his gang, and they used them in the horse race fixing racket that I mentioned. The interest in the guy might have something to do with that. One of the guards was acquainted with the night watch guard in the Gardner Museum. It was basically done the same way the Gardner Museum was in 1990. They dressed as police, knocked on the door, they cleaned out the audiovisual lab, got their hands on the equipment they needed. Similar to the Gardner heist, the guard made a statement to the BPD, the Boston Police, the next morning that the uniformed police officers knocked on the door and said they were investigating a disturbance. but allegedly in reality the guard was in on it. So again, right across the street from the Gardner, where 8 years later 500 million robbery occurs, 100 feet away, where the guard says he was summoned to the door by persons claiming to be police, the police overpower the guard and take control of the place. And this investigators have appeared to have overlooked or never gets reported on. So, there's a lot going on in Boston leading up to all of this. In October 1989, a man named Charles Stewart killed his wife, Carol Stewart, and blamed it on an unknown African-American man he said was trying to rob them. This occurred during a time of racial tension in the city because they had implemented a school integration busing program. This murder caused a lot of racial tension in the city until the truth was revealed that Stewart killed his own wife, and it was all a false story. You can watch a really interesting HBO special on this murder in Boston. The reason I'm mentioning it is because it happened 5 months before the Gardner heist and in the same precinct that the Gardner Museum was in. So it was a major preoccupation for law enforcement city officials, and you can also see how the police operated back then in Boston. It would be worth watching. 21 reputed mafia figures indicted. So March 18th, 5 months after that Stewart murder, March 18th, Gardner's robbed. In 1990, a week after the Gardner Museum is robbed, 21 indictments come down on the patriarchal crime family, New England Italian mob guys, and this totally overshadowed the Gardner robbery. So a lot was going on in Boston. So in January 1991, right after the robbery, 4 Irish supporters of the Irish Republican cause and an IRA soldier were arrested in Abington, Massachusetts for conspiring to rob an armored car. The involved parties were Pat Nee, seen here, Bobby Joyce, Michael Habite, James Murphy, and Michael McNaught. Pat Nee was born in Ireland. He was a Vietnam vet. He was a big guy in the Mullen gang. He joined that gang when he was 14 years old. And in a big gang war with the other gang of South Boston, he ended up helping broker the peace, ended up merging the two and became the Winter Hill Gang. He wrote this fascinating book, A Criminal and an Irishman. Bobby Joyce, one of the guys on his armored car job, was a union worker and owned Eddie's Tavern in Dorchester. Remember that town because I'm going to mention it later. I knew him personally and had many conversations with him. I found him to be a pretty interesting guy, really tough guy. Michael McNaught, actually they all are. Michael McNaught was the highest level IRA operative ever arrested in the United States. Nee was considered one of the masterminds of the 1984 operation to smuggle arms and AK-47s to the Provisional Irish Republican Army aboard the Valhalla fishing trawler that left Massachusetts loaded with several tons of weapons and was busted off the coast of Curry, Ireland after an informant tipped off the authorities of the smuggling operation. This thwarted armored car robbery with Nee and Joyce and McNaught occurred 10 months after the Gardner heist. So there was a lot going on in Boston over a long period of time. The city was tribal and neighborhood loyalties were strong, and there were a large number of sophisticated underworld operatives that they had to sift through when they started this investigation. And here's one of the main ones. In 1992, an Irish organized crime boss from Charleston, Massachusetts, named Joe Murray, was shot dead by his wife with a .357 Magnum in Maine. Murray was one of the largest marijuana distributors in Massachusetts, in the Boston region, and his close friend, Patrick Nee, who I just mentioned, was better known, like his friend Patrick Nee, was better known for this Valhalla fishing trawler operation where they were smuggling the tons of weapons to Ireland. Murray pled guilty to this in 1987. One FBI agent reported that Murray approached the FBI agent and wanted to broker a deal of stolen artworks to get one of his friends out of prison. So supposedly the art he had control of changed hands after his wife shot him with the .357 Magnum. Many insist it was indeed Murray who got his hands on the Gardner artworks and hid them somewhere in New York. Murray did not answer to Whitey Bulger and did not answer to the Winter Hill Gang, and he was a very loyal supporter of the IRA and the Irish Republican cause. This is Ann Hawley. I did her painting talking to a Boston Herald reporter. She's the current, was the last director of the Gardner. She stepped down, is active on the board, and this is a Tom Mashberger reporter. So in April '94, and this is very important, in April '94, Ann Hawley receives an anonymous letter postmarked from New York City that was the moment she was most hopeful they would get back to work, the works. The writer shared info in the letter that made the museum believe it was legit, info that only a true possessor of the works would know. In the second sentence, it offered a piece of information that had never been made public, and this writer knew, that attested to his credibility. So this writer wanted $2.6 million. The reward was only $1 million at the time. He wanted $2.6 million and immunity from prosecution. The immunity is a big problem in this, and I'm going to explain that next. The writer warned against heavy police or Fed involvement, but obviously she has to go to the Fed. So this is a Boston Globe. The writer refused further contact unless the Boston Globe inserted a number 1, as seen there, next to the Italian lira in the currency box in the Sunday edition. Criminals always did these dead letter drop kind of things. And that would show him they were interested in moving on with the negotiations. It ran on May 1st, 1994. The writer responded in another letter. He was encouraged to see the 1, but was alarmed at the heavy investigative activity of law enforcement. He asked in his next letter if the museum and authorities were more interested in recovering the paintings or arresting a low-level intermediary, and he wrote in big letters, "You cannot have both." And he said, "I need more time to figure this out, to keep my anonymity and this confidentiality in this exchange." They never received any other letters again, and this is the first botched incident in this investigation. The second comes in 1997, but this was their best chance, and they botched it. Here is a painting I did of Whitey Bulger and a dirty FBI agent named Connolly, John Connolly. So Connolly grew up in the same neighborhood as Bulger in South Boston. They grew up in the projects. He knew him growing up. Bulger was a little older. Bulger, in the end, they didn't know it, but it turns out he was an FBI informant. He was a mob boss, and he would give, and this was his handler. His friend from childhood was his handler, or vice versa. Bulger was his handler because he would give him info on his rivals, especially the Italian mob, and get them all busted and get them out of his way and take over businesses. And he would give Bulger, Connolly would give Bulger info on investigations and indictments to keep him out of trouble. In December 1994, Connolly tips off Bulger that sealed indictments are coming down from the Department of Justice. Bulger and his girlfriend fled. They were arrested in Santa Monica, California 16 years later. And he at the age of 81, he was murdered in federal prison not too long ago. Again, Whitey knew absolutely nothing about the art heist, but this is just another example of how chaotic Boston was at the time. You had all kinds of organized crime, you had tough guys running around in armored cars, banks were popular in Boston, and you had dirty FBI agents and dirty cops as well. In March 1997, 2 ex-police officers named Walter F. Robinson, seen here, and his partner Kenneth Acheta, who worked as detectives in the West Roxbury section of Boston known as Section E, Area E, were indicted on allegations that they stole money from drug dealers. They were accused of a $250,000 crime spree. Robinson was a 26-year veteran of the force who in the 1980s went into a real estate partnership with the notorious Charleston Irish mob underworld figure Joseph Murray, who I discussed earlier. Him and Murray owned vacation property near each other in Belgrade, Maine as well. So if cops were involved, they'd be dirty cops just like these. Here's a painting I did of William Youngworth III, talking to, the Herald Boston reporter Thomas Mashberg. So here's the second botched attempt, the second blunder. In June 1997, an FBI agent contacts Billy Youngworth. After the 94 letter writing, there were whispers that maybe he was the intermediary or had some access to the paintings. so they were interested. In 1997, and I'm condensing because this is a big long story and of time restraints, but he was an antiques dealer, William P. Youngwood III, entered into negotiations with the museum, leadership, and the FBI to return the Gardner artworks. He stated to get the artworks back, he wanted $5 million. Now it's a $5 million reward. They raised it. Now it's $10 million today. And total blanket immunity. So he wanted the $5 million total blanket immunity for all and any crimes that can be connected to the Gardner robbery. And he also wanted his good friend, Miles Connor, released from federal prison. So Miles Connor, the question of course the authorities had is Miles Connor at it again, stealing a Rembrandt to get out of federal prison? And maybe they conveniently threw Connor's name in there because they knew it would raise eyebrows, and it certainly raised eyebrows. During the negotiations, the feds played a cat and mouse game with Billy. They didn't want anyone who was involved with the crime to benefit from the crime, so they wanted to win and get back the artworks and arrest someone. They insisted that they needed proof before they move on with negotiations. They wanted him to bring in one item, maybe a drawing, maybe the eagle. He knew he'd be arrested for possession of stolen property, and he refused. And they said, you bring something in, we'll discuss limited immunity. And I emphasize limited. He wanted blanket immunity. So they wanted more proof. The reporter named Tom Mashberg was brought on a trip to the warehouse in Brooklyn where he allegedly saw Rembrandt's storm of the Sea of Galilee. The next day, this was the cover of the Boston Herald. We've seen it with the storm of the Sea of Galilee on it, and this was international news. The feds didn't accept that. That wasn't good enough. Some photos ended up in the mail. They weren't good enough. They said it was inconclusive. They still wanted proof. So again, he wasn't a dummy. So he wasn't going to trust him. But they wanted proof. A small amount of paint chips was inside an envelope that arrived, addressed to Tom Mashberg at the Boston Herald. The sample, and it was a small amount, so who did it knew what they were doing, not to damage the painting, just enough that they can test it. And this is the actual photo of the paint chips. The sample was tested by a Chicago-based expert named Walter McCrone. He's the same man who tested the Shroud of Turin. And he said it was, without a doubt, unadulterated Rembrandt. It was without a doubt Rembrandt. The problem was, and the feds jump on the case and say, it's not a Rembrandt, right? Problem was, Billy never said it was a Rembrandt, but Tom Mashberg did. And Tom Mashberg actually says that he said it was probably from the Rembrandt, but never said he confirmed it was from the Rembrandt. But the feds used this and jumped on it to label Billy a con man and said he's a con man. It was missing varnishes this didn't have the varnishes that the Rembrandt had. It didn't match at all the storm of the Sea of Galilee. So it was, they said the sample may have come from a 17th century Dutch master, but it wasn't from the Rembrandts. So 3 months later in 1998, two experts, one named Herman Kuhn, a real expert who in 1968 did tests on all kinds of Vermeers, and pigment analysis, including the painting, The Concert from the Gardner. So here is an expert who is familiar with this particular painting. They said they concluded this was definitely consistent with the Concert by the Vermeer, and it was too late. That once they get something, they start parroting it. It's not the Rembrandt, it's not the Rembrandt. And here you have Herman Kuhn and the other experts saying, wait a minute, this is consistent with the Vermeer. So the feds didn't want to grant the immunity Billy was asking, and they portrayed Billy as a con man, and the whole negotiations broke down. And that was their second blunder. But in 2003, and this is the part that they cut out on Pierce Brosnan, which is very important. In 2003, the FBI allowed an expert, Dr. Hubert van Sonnenberg, who was the head of conservation at the Met Museum. In October 8, 2003, he tested the paint chips, and he was the leading authority on Dutch painters and Rembrandt. This is a magnified photo of what Dr. van Sonnenberg was looking at. He examined the paint chips to determine the makeup of the paint composition. He concluded that this sample was a fingerprint match to the Vermeer. A highly respected expert who worked with von Sonnenberg was quoted as saying it would be almost impossible to produce a pigment sample that matched this stolen Vermeer. The mix of the pigments and chemical elements observed, coupled with the layer structure of the painting, make an almost fingerprint match. When the FBI finally admitted that this was consistent with the Vermeer, this paint sample, it was years later, and that was too late. That story gets buried. You don't even hear about it. The news did play up the fact that Dr. von Sonnenberg said he saw red lake matter present in this paint sample. This was a special red pigment that they used back then, and that Vermeer used, that was made with insects. This red was used in this carpet down here. That's where that little paint sample, again, the guy who gave them this paint sample knew right where to go to give them something to look at, good to look at. There was much more than the cochineal red lake matter finding. There was something specific that led Dr. von Sonnenberg to conclude that this sample came from the Vermeer. He told John Borelli, who was the very respected director of Met Museum security, that the chips absolutely came from a Vermeer, and he firmly believed it was from that concert. So they blew it in 1997. He told Borelli there was one cross-section that specifically matched. Borelli stated that when someone of Dr. Hubert von Sonnenberg's stature gives you his opinion, you can take it as gospel. This is Borelli's book. It's a really good read, stealing the show. So Dr. Hubert von Sonnenberg and other experts tested and declared in their finding that the paint chips were totally consistent with the stolen Vermeer, but the authorities and the museum admin pushed the false narrative of a hoax. So something needs to be clear when we're talking about Billy's request for immunity, Billy Unworth's request. The only reason the FBI are involved is because they can still bring federal charges. You know, they make it sound like they just want to get the paintings back, but they're involved, they're law enforcement. They're involved because federal crimes are active and they can bring charges. There are several statutes that still apply, but to prosecute individuals involved, but the major one is theft of major artwork, Title 18 United States U.S. Code 668, which is the theft of major artwork statute that was enacted after the Gardner robbery in 1994. The robbery itself propelled them to do so. Ted Kennedy, who was from Massachusetts, pushed this. They wanted large sentences if you stole from certain museums. So the statute makes it a felony punishable up to 10 years if you steal certain kind of artworks from the museums. But that statute wasn't enacted at the time of the Gardner, so that can't be used. But the statute also gives you 10 years to conceal, transport, or possess artwork, and if you knowingly know that it's stolen. So if someone's in possession of the Gardner works and know that it's stolen, he can be prosecuted under this statute. That's the main legal basis for the continuing federal investigation, and that complicates matters for anyone who wants to bring back these artworks. Trust is a big issue, and they go pretty hard on people. Let me briefly explain what accepting the immunity detail entails. People have the right to refuse questions by invoking their Fifth Amendment and not incriminate yourself. To convince criminals to talk, law enforcement officers will use a tool called an immunity order from a district court judge or a letter of immunity from the DA's office. Once they give you that immunity, you lose your Fifth Amendment. Now you have to talk. You can't incriminate yourself anymore. You have an immunity. People may still continue to refuse to talk at that point, especially if organized crime individuals are involved because they're afraid of being killed. After you receive the immunity, if you refuse to testify at the grand jury, you can be held for contempt and jailed. You can be kept in that jail cell for the life of the grand jury, which is 18 months. And after that, if you still refuse to talk, you can and testify, they'll indict you for criminal contempt. So the immunity is tricky because these guys want to bring back paintings and get rewards and have immunity, but they don't want to go in front of a grand jury and talk about someone that might kill them. And note that you're not given immunity until you first admit you're guilty. So you have to roll the dice and come in and say, I'm guilty, can I have a limited immunity? And they tell you whether or not you get it. Blanket immunity like Billy wanted for all crimes involved doesn't really exist. And obviously they weren't willing to make exceptions, not even to recover these masterpieces. And that ship has sailed, and it's not coming back, unfortunately. So in 2013, again, the FBI special agent in charge, Deslauer, and that's Anthony Amore, that security Gardner Museum, and this is Geoff Kelly, who runs the investigation in the Boston office. They declared they solved the case and knew who did it, but all the men were dead. They didn't name names, but they led reporters to believe that it was a crew of Italian-American mob guys working under Carmelo Merlino, who owned TRC Auto Shop in Dorchester, just 4 miles from the Gardner Museum. Dorchester is the same town that Bobby Joyce had the bar I was mentioning. These are two of his men, David Turner and George Reisfeld, and they kind of look like the police sketches. But on the night of the robbery, there were 2 kids that were walking by a car. There was a little gray hatchback, and they saw 2 cops in Boston PD uniforms sitting in there. And they got scared because they were drinking underage and it was St. Patrick's Day, but they got a good look at them. One of those witnesses said she saw the sketches and said the sketches didn't look like anything like the men they saw that night. Ulrich Boser went heavy on this story that these 2 pulled off the robbery without any real proof. He needed to come up with an ending of his book like everyone does. There's no ending. There's no ending unless you recover some paintings. So Turner was a real colorful character to write about. In February 1999, Merlino, Turner, and Stefan Rossetti, who is Mark Rossetti's cousin, the one I told you cased the Gardner heist in '81, they all got arrested for conspiracy to do an armored car job of a Loomis armored car in eastern Massachusetts. They were arrested going to do the job with heavily armed with a hand grenade. So again, weapons and even military-grade explosives, that's not the finesse of the Gardner robbers. They were immediately questioned about the Gardner heist and even promised lighter sentences if they produced some paintings. They had nothing to give. They got heavy sentences. Merlino died in prison. He obviously had nothing to share. Now people go with a cohort. Turner just got out recently too. So there's Reisfelder and here's Lenny de Muzio. Many people are running with the belief it was Reisfelder and the Mutt. Both are dead. Reisfelder died of an OD with a needle hanging out of his arm, and de Muzio got shot in the mouth. There's a message like you talk, you're a rat, you're an informant, like the old Sicilian guys used to put the canary in their mouth. So both dead. But this is the story now, the mob, right? Carmelo Merlino never had the paintings, but he thought he could get his hands on them. Everyone was looking for them, even Whitey Bulger. They knew someone had them, and if they could get them, they could profit from them. So he got into trouble prior to the Loomis car botched robbery with cocaine dealing, Merlino, and he was trying real hard to get his hands on the painting, and he made them think he might be able to get them, the feds. So he was out there trying to find them, but he never really had them. There are many reports explaining his maneuvers of him trying to get these paintings, including trying to kidnap someone's son who he thought had the paintings and he was going to ransom the son. But so since the 2013 FBI press conference I mentioned before, they have concentrated on this Italian mob crew, specifically Bobby Donati, that's him as an older guy, who was very loyal to Patriarchal Lieutenant Vinny the Animal Ferrara, and he was his driver. Donati was the driver, Ferrara was like a mentor, and also Ferrara's good friend, Bobby Guarente, and Guarente's good friend, Bobby the Cook, Gentile, and who lived in Connecticut and was actually a made Philadelphia guy, a made mob operative. So the Boston FBI office believes they had control of 2 of the paintings, possibly the large Rembrandts, and that they traveled from, Guarente gave them the Gentile, and they went from Massachusetts to Connecticut where Gentile lived and ended up right here in nearby Philadelphia in the control of the Philadelphia mob. So Miles Connor claims he gave Bobby Donati the idea for the Gardner job, and they cased it together in the 80s. And he claims Donati pulled off the Gardner job was Miles was in prison on another charge. Vinny the Animal Ferraro was facing decades in prison on RICO charges, and supposedly Donati and Bobby Guarente thought stealing the Rembrandts would help Ferraro with his charges like they did with Miles in the past. This is the current story that's being ran with, and I'd like to close with a little myth busting. This is Skinny Joey Merlino, who's considered a big guy in Philadelphia. Others will tell you he's living a pretty quiet life. So is Pat Nee, and so is a lot of them. Bobby Joyce just died. When you talk to investigators in Philly and Pennsylvania, especially from the Philadelphia office or the state police, they say they find it hard to believe that the Rembrandts ended up in Philadelphia in their hands and in their jurisdiction without them hearing anything or any whispers or anything from the street. They're not too sure those paintings ended up in Philadelphia. With all the mob wars over the years, the arrests, state witnesses who testify against their bosses and their friends and their gangs, they believe they would have heard something about this stolen art. And then the myth, Stephen Kurzian, a reporter from the Boston Globe, made a WBUR podcast last seen in which they parrot all the same stories and sound bites that they, of course, didn't have a significant ending. They parrot the sound bites, but they don't have an ending. So, on the very unreliable hearsay tip of a mob informant, a mob captain who was in the witness protection unit, said there might be some paintings hidden behind one of the guy's houses in Florida. The FBI went down to Florida. He gave them the tip. Went down to Florida, dug up the yard there. Kurzian and his crew, it's their last episode of Last Seen, the podcast. Kurzian and the crew are waiting across the street. They get all excited because they find a container. Every time the feds find a container or a large space that's big enough to fit the paintings, he's a suspect. Look, there's an empty space here. That container ended up to be an abandoned septic tank. So the ending of the WBUR podcast was literally a bunch of crap. More myths. Whitey Bulger. He knew nothing, but for years everyone said he had to have him. When they arrest him, they're going to get him back. And people were telling them, who were talking to the right people, we're hearing Whitey didn't know anything. Whitey knew nothing. Another myth, direct IRA involvement, Irish Republican Army. This is an oil I did of Thomas Slab Murphy, a general in the Provisional IRA. This is another oil painting I did of an IRA leader turned Sinn Féin parliamentarian, Martin Ferris. The Irish Republican Army would not have gotten their hands dirty in this kind of thing on American soil. Because look at how their supporters, the Irish neighborhood, got mad. Even Ted Kennedy got involved and pushed for the statute to arrest art thieves. So, I mean, the IRA would not have had direct involvement in this. And then other myths to be busted, Corsican criminals, Japanese Yakuza, Donna Reisfelder. George Reisfelder's sister, Donna, told a tall tale, and she was in This Is a Robbery Netflix series they made, the Netflix show, saying that her brother, George, hung the Chez Tortoni above his bed in the bedroom, and she saw it there all the time in his apartment, and that's absolutely ridiculous. So, and then another myth that makes me laugh is that using billboards and social media campaigns can help find the artworks. I mean, it's really ridiculous. And in the WBUR follow-up to the Last Seen podcast, Stephen Kurzian, that reporter, said that a social media campaign like the Ice Bucket Challenge would help get the paintings back. But this is absolutely ridiculous because only a direct appeal to the actual possessors of these paintings would get anything back. So these are all myths, and let's not talk about them ever again. Let's cut through the fluff and tell this story a little differently. I tried to tell it a little differently. It's time to empty that wine cup and fill it a little more wisely. I believe one masterpiece will be recovered. I believe that, and it would take more than $10 million to get that one back, considering what it's worth. I'm confident we'll get back at least one piece. I don't believe we'll ever get the eagle back. They're offering $100,000 for the eagle. There was another recent reporting in the Herald or the Globe. A guy 20, 30 years later who owned a little antique shop said that Bobby Donati, who he knew personally, walked in with the eagle and wanted to sell it. And he said, "What are you crazy?" And I mean, and that eagle shows up everywhere. They thought they saw it in TRC Auto, the eagle on a shelf. But who would want to get busted with that thing? You go into those jaws of justice and never get out, like a bulldog jaw. Boom. You got that eagle, you're never getting out until you produce other things for them. Because like Bobby the Cook Gentile, they thought he had something. They went and raided his whole house in Connecticut. They used metal detectors. Again, they found a big space with nothing in it. But he has to, and he almost died in prison because of it. Because every mob guy has guns buried in their yard. They knew they were going to find guns. They used metal detectors. They found his guns. They threw him in prison. Same thing with Youngworth. They went hard on him. They thought he had something. They set him up with an informant. They bust him for the stolen van and some firearms. And then he ends up in prison for a few years. So you want to get caught with an eagle that's not worth that much? I mean, it's not coming back. But again, one I think is coming back. I'm confident that one piece will come back, but the others, it might take 100 years to get them back. I think one ended up in the Middle East. I'm going to make a direct appeal to my YouTube channel, to the sophisticated people that possess these paintings. I'm speaking directly to anyone, anywhere who has something they want to come forward with and try to claim the reward, which is now 10 million, even though it should be more. As far as any pieces are concerned, if you have them or have substantial info to impart, you contact me directly. You don't want to go to anyone else. Don't contact me with theories or stories. I'm now talking to the actual possessors of any of these artworks. The legal maneuvering will be tricky at that point, and one can find themselves enmeshed in criminal litigation real fast. So you should contact me directly, and that will serve you well. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Now you're Italian, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and you're an artist, correct?
Yeah.
Where were you that night?
I don't recall.
Is Youngworth still alive?
Yes, Youngworth is still alive and doing really well. The last time he was in, when he got out for that whole thing with the stolen car, I think in 2002 or 3, it was a traumatic time for them. His son was a little boy, and the wife died while he was in prison, and it was just really bad for them, but he turned his life around. It shows you that some people can go turn their life around, and they revamped the whole antiques business and have a booming business. The son's involved too. They're doing really well.
What piece do you think will be recovered?
I'm not going to say,
Oh.
and I won't say which one I think is in the Middle East.
Okay.
There is a possibility that those Rembrandts ended up in Philly, although people doubt it because they would have heard something. It's not, and people that get in trouble, people that go into witness protection and no one hears anything in that region, and it's the Boston office telling Philly that they're there. But again, to the YouTube channel, Joey Merlino, I'd like to paint his painting and get him to dinner. We got a lot to talk about, so. And I knew Joey Merlino's uncle.
Miles Connor turned his life around?
No. And he wrote a book. He's a proud outlaw, right? He's an outlaw. He claims he did over 30, and he really did. He did over 30 plus art heists. But he also was involved in everything, in violent crimes, in selling cocaine. He was in and out of prisons, but he wrote a book bragging about his crimes. His father was a really good sergeant of the police, and his brother was a cop, and another brother was a priest. And he said, I don't know where any of them went, why they all went wrong. These are a lot of characters, like real characters. Like Connor's a character. He was a rock and roll star, and was really smart. But he liked to be an outlaw. That was his thing. And he got into little things over the years. Like he was teaching someone in the family, I don't know if it was a brother-in-law or someone, how to pull off robberies, and they went to steal some watches, like Rolexes, and they got busted. And then they have all animals at that Blackstone farm, and he got caught stealing hay to feed the animals, and everyone was laughing. Instead of Monet haystacks, he's now stealing hay. But I mean, he's older now and he had some health issues. So I do think he's probably living a quiet life. I doubt if he's gonna wanna run across. But this guy's had shootouts with cops. He escaped from jail. He's in jail for something. He carved a bar of soap to look like a gun and painted it black, and he escaped with that gun. He shot a cop once. He got beat up by cops like really bad, hung off a roof. He's had a life like that, and I think I'm hearing he's gonna get a movie deal soon. He's wanted one for years.
And the 2 guards were totally cleared?
So one guard was supposed to work that night, called off sick, and quit.
But didn't
That guard that didn't show up went to France and died, from what I understand. But there was a guard that didn't show up and not only called off sick, but he quit. And then so Randy, Rickabath's partner that night, he was a new jack. He was a newbie, brand new on the job. And he was a music student. And he shows up with his trombone to practice while he's at the desk, right? And then his like first week on the job, he's chained to the pipes all night. They thought they were gonna die, you know? But I do believe Randy's still alive. Yeah.
And so there was no resolution to that mystery of why the motion detector saw somebody in a room at 12 o'clock, but the robbers entered it after 1 o'clock?
No, Rickabath did his rounds. It was an eventful night when it usually isn't. He had a couple fire alarms on the top floors and he turned them off. There was no smoke condition, there was no sign of fire. And when he entered that room briefly to walk through it doing his rounds, he's the only one the motion detectives have entering that room and leaving. And then he relieved Randy on the desk, and one thing that was suspicious was he's not supposed to open the doors, and there's 2 doors. It's like a man trap. One opens, you have to open the next one to let them in. Now they're between 2 doors. He opened the side door when he took the desk, and then he closed it. So he went out, opened the door, got a breath of fresh air, and goes back in, again breaking protocol, which makes people think, were they sitting out in the hatchback waiting for him to open the door to give a signal that he was sitting at the desk? He also lived around the corner from Billy Youngworth's antique store, and he got beat up a couple doors down from Youngworth's. There's all these little things that tie in, and it's so much for them to sift through. But they cleared him because they couldn't charge him, not because they couldn't decide one way or the other. Is he guilty or not guilty? You can't charge someone without the probable cause. And a lot of people thought he was too stupid to be involved with these guys. You know, they definitely had at one point inside information, and it could have been those pass cards from 1981 when the Rossetti gang case took place, but they had the layout of the whole place. There was even a door in the Dutch room, a secret door that goes to the conservation room that was left open, that no one should have known was there. So there's a lot to this, but the fact that the Monet was missing and no motion detectors went off, at first people were thinking, well, did dirty cops go shopping when they walked in? I don't think so, because when they walked in, that frame was on the chair right at the Palace Road door, and behind it is the office. So I mean, it means that it was there before the people came to free, or did someone come in from that, or did someone come in after those bad guys left? They come in from behind, from that apartment where Bob Hadley lived maybe, or came in from behind that open secret door and sneaked down on the first floor. Who knows? But it's a big mystery. But now he's dead, so they can't even, he wouldn't talk to anyone for years, and then he gave Stephen Kurdzian from the Globe interview, which is interesting to hear him discuss it.
Were they insured? Was everything insured?
No, and that's a problem. So maybe they thought they were insured. When it's insured, especially back then, things got stricter. But when insurance companies are involved, the bad guy can deal directly with the insurance company. It makes it easy. It's like, this thing's worth, say, they were saying back then 200 million. These works are worth 500 million, more than 500 million on auction, right? You see the prices things are going for. So if something's worth 100 million, like say the Vermeer, they're saying back then it was worth 100 million. If they insured it for 300,000 and they can pay you 150,000, they broke they came out okay in this, you know. They might even pass it car to car on the highway, here's, you know. But no, they weren't insured, they couldn't afford to insure those artworks. The museum was in really bad shape back then. They had leaks in the ceiling, rain coming in, they had conservation problems, they had all kinds of issues, and they needed to afford revamping security. And oddly enough, when they put those empty frames on the walls, after this robbery, everyone wanted to go to the Gardner. And they go there to see the empty frames, and for years, and now it's a really wealthy museum. Well, thank you.